you ever wondered if the Septuagint is backed up by the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly when the Septuagint diverges from the traditional Masoretic Hebrew text? Well, we're going to examine 7 compelling examples today that are going to shed a little bit of light on this. I want you to stay to the end because we're going to look at how this impacts New Testament references and also particularly a highly important messianic prophecy. Well, I don't want to waste your time, so let's jump right in. First question I have for you today is, how tall was Goliath? Well, if you follow the traditional Hebrew text, like King James Version, I have the JPS version in front of me right now. JPS version says that Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. But then if you look at the Septuagint version, Goliath's height was 4 cubits and a span. So the difference between 6 cubits and a span and 4 cubits and a span. Well, which was it? Well, it'll be interesting to know because we know that the manuscripts for the Septuagint, and by the way I'm using the term Septuagint today is just a very common way of referring to the Septuagint. It's basically the edition that you'll find in something like Ralph's Septuagint. It's the printed edition that we have now. But these manuscripts for the Septuagint go way back. They're very early. And we think that it was translated very, very early. But it depends on what book it is as to how far back it goes. So if you don't know what the Septuagint is, or you're wondering about the definitions of how different people use the term Septuagint, watch my other video on the Hebrew Bible versus the Septuagint. But I'm just using it a very general way for today's purposes. But which one is it? We know that the Septuagint manuscripts that we have are much more ancient than the Masoretic text, but we think that the Masoretic tradition has preserved a very good text. But what's interesting is that as far as Hebrew manuscripts go, I think that the earliest Masoretic text that we have dates around 900 AD, something along that lines. But the truth is that since we've made these discoveries in Qumran, these Dead Sea Scrolls, we have access to manuscripts that are almost 1,000 years earlier. Interestingly enough here, this Dead Sea Scrolls support, particularly a Dead Sea Scroll, supports the reading from the Septuagint. That is, it supports the idea that Goliath might not have been 9'6" or 9'9", depending on how you count a cubit, but he might have been closer to 6'6" or 6'7". Now, there's some pushback on that, and there's some arguments for the traditional reading here. But if you want to know what our earliest and oldest reading here, the available reading that we have is that he was 4 cubits and a span and not 6 cubits and a span. Now, towards the end of this video, I'm going to kind of wrap up where I land on which reading is right between these various examples that we're going to give, but I'm just kind of giving you the evidence right now. And so the interesting thing on this one is not only does this text from Qumran and the Septuagint agree, we also could bring Josephus to witness as well. Josephus also thinks that Goliath was 4 cubits and a span rather than 6 cubits and a span. So it must be that men were generally shorter than that for this idea even to catch on. Even if the 6 cubits and a span is correct, it's odd, at least from a modern standpoint, the way we think of the height of men, to think of someone being 6'6" being a giant. Here's another example. Here's our second example. We can ask the question, is Psalm 145 an acrostic poem? Now, in Hebrew, many of the Psalms are arranged according to a acrostic pattern. That is, it starts with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, etc. It just goes on to the end of the Hebrew alphabet. Well, Psalm 145 is a perfect acrostic poem except for it's missing one Hebrew letter. And so if you follow the Hebrew text, it seems to be missing the section that would start with the letter Nun. And we have a good summary of what's going on here in the Net Bible. The Net Bible gives us a good summary. So I'm going to display for you on the screen the Masoretic text as it appears in the JPS edition. JPS is a Jewish translation. I did that so that sometimes our Christian translations can be influenced by, the Septuagint or other resources, things like that. But this is a translation that has been translated from a Jewish perspective. And it's going to say, "Thy kingdom is a kingdom for all ages, thy dominion endureth throughout all generations. The Lord upholdeth all that fall, and raiseth up all those that are bowed down." That's Psalm 145, 13 through 14. But if you follow the Septuagint, and here I'll give you the reading from the Lexham English Septuagint, it says, "Your kingdom is a kingdom over all the ages, and your dominion in every generation and generation. Faithful is the Lord in his words, and holy in all his works. The Lord supports all those who are falling down, and sets up again all those who have been broken down." Now again, if you follow the summary in the Net Bible, this is a note that concerns the variant here. And it says, "Several ancient witnesses, including one medieval Hebrew manuscript, the Qumran scroll from Cave 11, the LXX, and the Syriac supply the missing noon verse, which reads as follows: The Lord is reliable in all his words and faithful in all his deeds. Now, this little fragment of what presumably we should take as the original reading, if we're following the Septuagint, is obviously missing in the Hebrew text. Now, which one got it right? Well, again, what's interesting here is that the text from Qumran, that is Cave 11, that's 11Q5, has this missing phrase. So again, the Septuagint is supported by our most ancient Hebrew text. And so it's something to consider, something to think about. Again, we'll come back to this towards the end of the video, but just sort of laying out the case for you right now. Now, the third one that we have to look at probably has a little bit of, maybe a little bit of doctrinal implication. So that's in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8. Is it sons of Israel or sons of God or angels of God? So the JPS edition has this: When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the children of men, he set the borders of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. The Lexham English Septuagint has this: When the Most High distributed nations, as he scattered the descendants of Adam, he set up boundaries for the nations according to the number of the angels of God. So the difference in Deuteronomy 32:8 between the Hebrew edition and the Septuagint edition is, did he divide and set the borders according to the children of Israel, or did he set them according to the number of the angels of God? Again, the Bible has excellent notes in regards to this. Even if you disagree with the notes, it has excellent notes. And according to the Net Bible's editors, they say the sons of God is undoubtedly the original reading. I think that's a pretty bold statement. It says the MT, that is the Masoretic text, and LXX, have each interpreted it differently. MT assumes the expression sons of God refers to Israel, while LXX has assumed that the phrase refers to the angelic heavenly assembly. So why this is important is that certain scholars, the one that comes to mind, to the top of my mind, is Michael Heiser, has made a good deal out of this, that there was this idea of a heavenly council, that the sons of God participated in this divine assembly, and there were the council that went forth, and all of this. And Michael Heiser, in his article, writes this: Should the verse be rendered sons of Israel or sons of God? The debate over which is preferable is more than a fraternal spat among textual critics. The notion that the nations of the world were geographically partitioned and owed their terrestrial identity to the sovereign God takes the reader back to the table of nations in Genesis 10 through 11. So Heiser thinks this is a highly important text. Well, the interesting thing, again, is that the Septuagint, while it reads angels of God, is supported by a Hebrew text, again found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would read sons of God. And the idea here would be is that the Septuagint translation, now there are variants within the some of the Greek translations as well. I believe, if I remember right, there's a manuscript or two or maybe more that actually, Greek manuscript that actually reads sons of God here. But the idea is that in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes sons of God would be a reference to angels. So you can think of Job, when the sons of God present themselves before the Lord and Satan also comes among them. More controversial is the one in Genesis 6. And so here we have the most ancient Hebrew text that we have in possession supporting, apparently, the Septuagint text. So this is significant and something we have to wrestle with. One other example that I'll mention too is Jeremiah. So there's considerable differences in the book of Jeremiah, in the Septuagint, and in the Hebrew Bible. And this is one that I'm just going to direct you. There's a lot of websites that are available that you can look at these. And what's interesting is that there are times where you can find support for these readings, sometimes shorter readings in the Septuagint, in these texts from Qumran. But it also seems like there's times where the fuller reading in the Masoretic text is supported. So Jeremiah is an interesting book. Of course, we know that there's a story of how the book of Jeremiah had been, taken, there'd been a penknife taken to the text and chopped up. So you kind of wonder if that has something to do with its transmission history. But I just want to drop an earmark here that the book of Jeremiah, as is presented in the Septuagint, sometimes finds very ancient support in Qumran. So take a look at that as well. But what we're about to go into is these last three examples that I want to go through are areas where the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls are right in line with what we find in the New Testament. And so Solomon says that a threefold cord is not easily broken. And so we want to ask the question, are there places where both the New Testament aligns with the Septuagint? What I think is very clear is that if you've been a reader of the Bible for very long, you probably encountered times where the New Testament text looks quite a bit different than what you see sometimes in the Old Testament, place where it's being quoted in your English Bible. Well, sometimes it's because your Hebrew Bible, rather your English Bible, has translated the Hebrew in the Old Testament and translated the Greek in the New Testament. And sometimes there's some small variations between those. Well, we want to ask the question, are there any examples in the New Testament where both the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to align against the Hebrew Masoretic text? Now, let's look at a simple one just to kind of start that question off. Let's look at one that's fairly well known and sometimes brought up by Bible skeptics, and that's in Exodus 1:5. So Exodus 1:5, again, I'm going to read out of the JPS edition. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt already. So the Hebrew edition, 70 souls. But the Septuagint, again, I'm quoting for the Lexham English Septuagint, says Joseph was already in Egypt, and all the persons from Jacob were 75. So this is interesting. That's a difference of 5 people. What makes this even more fascinating to me is that as Luke records the speech of Stephen in the book of Acts, I believe that's chapter 7, Stephen doesn't say 70 souls, he says 75. So that's interesting. So did Stephen make a mistake? And you could still maintain inerrancy, really, and say that Stephen made a mistake, but Luke accurately recorded it. Or maybe Stephen didn't make a mistake. Maybe Stephen was following the Septuagint. Well, the question is, does the Septuagint have any other support? Well, here we have a text from Qumran again, 4Q1, which has 75. Now, what's interesting is, depending on how you count these, there's charts out there, you can see these different charts, how depending on if you include Jacob and his wives, or there's different ways to count it, one to get 70, one to get 75. The important question here is, Was Stephen following the Septuagint? And if he was following the Septuagint, do we have good support for the Septuagint? Because our earliest Hebrew text that we have actually agrees with the Septuagint and gives us 75. So here we have the potential to have a threefold chord. Both we have the Septuagint, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have a New Testament quotation. And so this is a very, very interesting one for those of us that are interested in the transmission of the text and which text that we should follow for the most accurate detail that we can get on some of these things. Now, again, as we get closer to the video, we'll wrap up with some conclusions on this. Let's look at another one right now. Deuteronomy 32:43. Now, I'm going to read from, actually, this is Brenton's translation here, and I think he captures the Greek better than the Lexham English Septuagint that we've been quoting from previously. He says, "Rejoice, ye heavens, with him, and let all the angels of God worship him." Now, what's interesting here is this bit about the angels of God worshiping him. This is not in the Hebrew text, but it appears to have been quoted in the book of Hebrews. So in the first chapter of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says, "Let all the angels of God worship him." That appears to be a quote from Deuteronomy 32:43 from the LXX. Now, there is pushback on this because there's also a chance this could be a quotation from Psalm 96:7. But we know from the book of Hebrews that the writer of Hebrews, whether you think it's Paul or whether you think it's somebody else, doesn't matter to me right now. The writer of Hebrews often quotes from the LXX. And so it seems very possible that here he's quoting from Deuteronomy 32:43. If that's the case, again, we have this threefold chord where you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have the Septuagint, and you have the New Testament all aligning for a particular reading. Now, the last one we want to discuss today is probably the most important one of all because it has messianic implications. So let me quote to you first from the King James Version Bible of Psalm 22:16. So Psalm 22:16 says, "For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." Now, if you have the JPS edition, it reads like this. So here's an example where one of the rare times where it seems like the King James Version follows the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text reads like this. This is from the JPS edition. "For dogs have encompassed me. A company of evildoers have enclosed me. Like a lion, they are at my hands and my feet." So whereas the King James Version is talking about piercing hands and feet, the JPS edition or the Hebrew edition is talking about a lion. A lion, they are at my hands and feet. So interestingly here, you'll have various translations of the Septuagint. So one translation of the Septuagint, this is the most recent translation of the Septuagint, this is the Net's translation, it says this, "Because many dogs encircled me, a gather of evildoers surrounded me, they gouged my hands and feet." However, the Lexham English translation that we've cited most often in this video says this, "For many dogs encircled me, a gathering of those doing evil surrounded me, they dug a trench for my hands and feet." Why the differences in these translations? Well, very fascinating things are going on here. One is that for really centuries, Christians saw this as a messianic prophecy. I think rightly so. I mean, the Psalm starts out with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I mean, it's quoted by Jesus on the cross. And so much of it sounds like what Jesus endured through his trial and crucifixion. And so Christians were inclined to see this as a messianic prophecy. And so you find the Geneva Bible translating this like the King James Version did after it. They pierced my hands and my feet. You see people like Justin Martyr and Tertullian citing this as a messianic prophecy. The Greek word that's used in the Septuagint probably would normally translate it as pierced. Probably gouged is maybe a better way, but it's most typically used for dug, like digging, So you would think of them maybe burrowing in the hand or something. That's why the Lexham English Septuagint tries to bring it out, and they add the word trench. They dug a trench for my hands and feet. But I do like how the Net translation, a New English translation of Septuagint, has done it. They gouged my hands and my feet. And so this is where this idea came about, where it was some sort of gouging or piercing. But there wasn't a lot of external support for this reading. In fact, even when they began searching the caves of Qumran, there was a manuscript that was found, 4QPSF, was discovered, but seems defective at the very place where we want it to give us certainty on this. But what's interesting is that in a nearby area, another scroll was found, and in this scroll, it too seems a little bit faded, but the translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible rendered this as, "They have pierced my hands and my feet." And I'm now going to quote from a man by the name of Conrad Green. He wrote a Jets article and a journal article, and he says this: though the documents, that is this document that I just told you about that contains this reading, though the documents were discovered in 1951 or 52, this reading was not discovered until around 1997. Further, it did not appear in print until the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible was published in 1999. The implications are enormous. Here we have a Hebrew text over 1,000 years older than the oldest copy of the standard Hebrew Masoretic text, which supports the reading found in the Greek Septuagint, Syriac, and Vulgate. No longer can Hebrew scholars claim that the LXX, Syriac, and Vulgate are here faulty reflections of the Hebrew Bible. And so there are complications about, this is basically a one-letter difference in Hebrew. Basically, it comes down to one little stroke, and it makes us ask these very fundamental questions when Jesus said that one jot or one tittle would not pass away. Is the correct reading preserved in the Masoretic text, or has it been preserved in another way? And in this case, I think we have good reason to think that perhaps God has preserved this in another way. It seems that the Greek text has actually preserved the correct reading, it seems to me, that this does have something to do with this piercing or gouging. And the reason I'd say this is it does seem like we have a threefold witness here. We have the New Testament agreeing, our oldest Hebrew text agreeing, and we have the Septuagint agreeing here. And so we've got this threefold cord, and I think that's important here. Not only that, you've got the Syriac. I don't know how important the Vulgate would really be in this context, but we have a good reasons for thinking that this is correct. Now, I am one who is very hesitant to let go of any Masoretic text readings. And even this one, I still have some hesitation, but it does seem like we've got good reasons for thinking that perhaps here, this might be one place where we could think that maybe the Septuagint has come closer to the original text. At least it's worth pondering. Now, as far as these others, what about the height of Goliath? What about some of these others? I'm willing to consider those. But again, I do think that we have a solid Masoretic text. I think they did their best to preserve it. But I do think that we should supplement our studies with things like the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We look at that. When you see alignment, those are things that should give us some pause, make us think. But for me, when I see the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, and the New Testament all aligning together, that gives me some serious pause to consider the Septuagint reading. Something like this takes quite a bit of time to put together and a lot of work to put together. So if you like this sort of thing, please let me know down in the comment section so I know if it's worth the effort to put things together like this for you. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.